Welcome to Your World, a program about whatever is international at Central, sponsored by the Office of International Studies and Programs. Today, the topic is the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps was founded 47 years ago by John F. Kennedy, and since that time, the world has undergone many changes, and so has the Peace Corps. Today, we're going to talk about the Peace Corps from the level of personal experience as well as its global impact. And all three of us today are former Peace Corps volunteers. And so I'd like to first introduce my guests. To my right, Loran Cutsinger from the Anthropology Department, and Mike Launius, Executive Director of the Office of International Studies and Programs and Political Science Professor. Now, all three of us were in different countries at different times and doing a variety of different things. So maybe we'll start off with each of us introducing our own Peace Corps experience. Loran?
So I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Eastern Caribbean islands from 1985 to 1987. And Peace Corps assigns a few islands and designates them as the Eastern Caribbean, but I lived in Barbados and worked at the Barbados Museum as a curator.
And Mike?
I was a Peace Corps volunteer in South Korea from 1974 to 1976, and I taught English as a second language to middle school students, as well as teachers of middle school students at workshops in South Korea.
And I was at the end of the first decade of the Peace Corps, from 1968 to 1971. I was in Iran, a country that recently has become known to most people because of the news in that part of the world. And I was also an English teacher and trained other English teachers. So maybe we'll talk a little bit first about your motivation for joining the Peace Corps and whether the experience supported the motivation, whether you felt like you got out of it what you hoped to get. Loran?
Well, it was almost a stroke of luck, that a funny mistake that happened that sent me and my husband to the Peace Corps. We went together. We were graduate students at Washington State University, and apparently by mistake, someone put up a notice that said Peace Corps volunteers wanted to do archaeology and museum work. And we were astonished. We thought, well, we never knew that Peace Corps would want such skills. And then so that sent us to inquire about it. And then I have to thank my professor, Linda Stone from WSU, who also supported me, and she had been a Peace Corps trainer in Nepal. So those are the things that just took us to inquire about Peace Corps and just go for the experience.
So you found yourself doing exactly the kind of work you wanted to do, you were motivated to do.
Absolutely, yeah. And like a whole slew of people now, I find out in later years, anthropologists who want to do research are doing it in conjunction with the Peace Corps, and I was able to do that too.
Mike, how would you describe your motivation?
Well, I was sort of a product of the late 60s and early 70s in terms of it being the Vietnam era. And when I went through college, it was kind of a radicalizing and transformative period. I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, and I went 5 straight years and I did a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. And the emphasis that I had in my academic preparation was in Asian studies, Asian politics, international relations, that kind of thing. But I had never been outside of the United States with the exception of a short trip to Canada. And so I thought it might not be a bad idea to get some field experience. And I didn't want to get field experience as a soldier, so I joined the Peace Corps. And originally I wanted to go to Southeast Asia, but the first invitation that was sent from the Peace Corps was for South Korea. So I wanted to go.
So at that point, did you have a lot of knowledge or information about Korea?
Not about Korea specifically. My major interest had been China, but in those days you couldn't get into China, or you couldn't get out if you got into China. And so the next best thing for me was to go to South Korea, which I think was really, turned out to be a good thing, although I hadn't anticipated in that way. In that in those days, very few Americans other than soldiers or Westerners in general were in Korea. So it was an opportunity to travel around, spend 2 years traveling around the interior of Korea at a time when there were virtually no tourists or other folks from anywhere else in the world going there and seeing that. So I had some really unique opportunities.
For myself, I knew when I was invited by the Peace Corps to go to Iran, to a training program for Iran, I knew absolutely nothing about the country, as close to zero as one can get in terms of knowledge about another place. I had studied Spanish for years and had asked to go to South America, but sometimes this is what happens in the Peace Corps process. I got invited to go to Iran, started doing some studying in the library, got a lot of information, positive and negative. Finally made a decision to go, that this would be an incredibly exotic and exciting place to be. Like you, I had never been out of the United States. I'd hardly been anywhere in the United States, actually. Grew up in Florida on the East Coast, and I'd been just up and down the East Coast. So it was, for me, one of these explosive experiences to be outside the United States for the first time. I had never met so many Americans from other parts of the country. We had about 60, 70 people in the training program from every part of the United States. So that, from the beginning, was pretty exciting. And the whole experience was, every day was something new, to learn something exciting, even before you got to the country. And when I was in the Peace Corps, the training was partially in the U.S. and partially in country. I'm going to guess that maybe for you it was entirely in the country?
Ours was sort of a week of immersion in the mountains of Virginia, if I remember, and then 3 months in country.
So you did have some
it was mostly
US.
in-country training, yeah.
Did you have any U.S. training?
We spent 3 days in San Francisco getting shots before they dropped us
That's
in the
it.
middle of South Korea, so it was 99.9% was done in country.
In talking, and probably you have too with other Peace Corps people, and it seems that there are, different aspects of the benefit of the Peace Corps, or the results that people hope to have, or the U.S. government hopes to have. I mean, there's the personal growth, there's the contribution that you make to that culture through your work, there's the PR that you do for America by being a good representative, and then there's the information and experience you bring back to the United States to teach people about the country you've been in. How do you feel about, how do those resonate with you?
They do. All of those seem sort of enduringly true to my experience. They, around the period when we were in the Peace Corps, it was said that you would get more out of it than you'd probably give back, and I think that definitely seemed true. I've had great experiences sharing my Peace Corps experience with other people. Those seem enduringly true to me. All those aspects. We weren't in a very politically charged place, and that can make a difference in people's Peace Corps experience. I mean, among many other things.
More relaxed, less concern about doing something that might...
Relaxed. The Caribbean is a pretty good place to live, although you quickly learn how there it's the tension of tourism as against local citizens, and just the difficulties around that, and the differences in people's lives, and the massive differences in wealth. Those are features of living in the Caribbean islands.
So Mike, for you, how do you weigh, if it's possible to weigh, or the different benefits that
I think of the three areas, probably the least consequential was the contributions that I made to English language education in Korea. I think I had some minor impact in introducing some new pedagogical techniques into the middle school system, but I worked with a co-teacher, Mr. Yoon, and he and I had 7 classes of 60 boys that we handled each week, and with a number of students that's simply an overwhelming task. So the major benefit I think that I got was the cultural aspects that I learned, the different social aspects of living in Korea, and how people in developing countries really have very difficult and complex problems with which they have to deal. And for the most part, they can deal with them pretty well. Most Americans don't understand that it's not easy to fix certain social economic problems in developing countries. So it was a really great learning experience for me. I think the major contribution I may have given to Korea was for the great majority of Koreans with whom I interacted, I was the first American that they'd ever actually talked to, that they'd ever actually met. People knew a lot about or thought they knew a lot about the United States from television or movies, but in many cases I was the first American they'd ever talked to. In some cases I was the first white person they'd ever seen in the flesh. And I think the major accomplishment was that they got to see that Americans didn't all live in big mansions and didn't all drink bourbon all day long as they had seen on TV, and that they were real people who had real emotions and they could connect with, and in some cases bond with. And I really think that was my major contribution as a Peace Corps volunteer.
Yeah, I would have to say for myself that personal transformation was huge for me. I mean, at 21, just out of school, with very limited life experience and very almost no travel experience, to very quickly be thrust into a culture that was not only physically thousands of miles away from the U.S., but also in terms of the differences between the culture, they were huge. And looking back, I can see the inadequacies in many ways of my training program and many things that I would like to have been better prepared to handle. And also, I would say if I did anything towards improving relations between the U.S. and Iranians, it didn't last very long, as you can see, with political events. Was on a personal level, lots of very close friendships, and also people who had never met Americans before, and the stereotypes from movies. They couldn't believe that I was short, not blonde, and did not have wads of money or guns in my pocket, as they had seen from all the gangster movies. But today, the Peace Corps, I haven't researched it in great detail, but I get a sense that the Peace Corps has changed quite a bit, not just in the countries that are available now, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, but in the kinds of people the Peace Corps is attracting, and the motivation and the skills. Because Loran, you said that you've talked to a lot of Central students who either have gone or are interested.
Yes,
what are you
especially I'm
getting?
familiar with the ones from Anthropology, and I'd really like to know we'll try to find out how many from Central have gone. But in Anthropology alone, amongst our majors, we've had 5 or 6 going in the last 5 years. Panama, Eastern Europe, Senegal, Ivory Coast. Another student's about to go to Solomon Islands. So yeah, definitely.
Have you met some of the students who've come back?
I have, yeah. Some of them, a couple actually. One is now, West Africa, as we might expect, poses the biggest health challenges. But both of these young men who went from our anthro students had a fantastic experience overall. And one of them is working on a doctoral program now to do the genetics of a cure for malaria, which I think directly came out of his Peace Corps experience. And the other was in Senegal and just has a great facility for local languages. Just absolutely great stuff. It really has been something that anthro students, and they feed on each other. I mean, one of those students just came back, the one who was in Senegal. He's going on to grad school now too, and he met with a whole bunch of our anthro students who have an interest.
Well, one of the criticisms that I've heard leveled at the Peace Corps was in the past, like during the time I was there, and probably continued certainly into the next decade, was that a lot of the people that were sent over were just young university graduates, often liberal arts graduates, and what they call the BA generalists, right? The BA generalist, and where they felt that you were educated so that you were able to learn a language well, which wasn't always true, and that they could train you quickly for some kind of general skills such as language teaching or community development. And there were many stories about people from that kind of background who were not particularly effective because they didn't have specific skills. But during those days, the countries were not necessarily asking for specific skills. I think there was the idea if they had an American there that he or she would provide some kind of assistance.
I think there's a lot of variability in that, maybe even up to today, about depending on the region, depending on the country, as to who goes into Peace Corps and where they're signed. And one feature about the Caribbean is that they can accept, mainly for health reasons, older volunteers. And we were so sort of inspired by some of the older volunteers. One of our friends who was with us in the Eastern Caribbean had already done 2 years in Tunisia, well into her 70s, doing special education projects, and there were a number of retired people with us.
And so that's something relatively new, maybe the last decade or so, retired people.
Probably, I'm not sure when that started.
Yeah, in the group that I was in of about 30, there was one older woman who I think was in her late 50s, early 60s, and an older man by our standards who was in his 40s. I think everybody else was pretty much 20-something at that time. But a large, I think in terms of older people in large numbers, that's much more recent.
One of the impressions I've had in recent years is that the countries are asking for people with more specific skills, and that if the U.S. can't provide somebody with specific business education, specific kind of public health, background, they're really not interested. And it sounds like the students that you've been in contact with have specific skills. Is that?
Actually, I mean, I have to think about that. They really are. They are actually more the traditional, or the model that you described, where they're going right out of college and they have degrees in anthropology, which, of course, I'm biased, but I think it is a really good background for getting a lot out of Peace Corps and being able to, work well at a local, in a different cultural context, and anthropology is good for that, of course. But yeah, I think another thing that's quite new, just since we were in Peace Corps, is the business angle that you mentioned. Yeah. That is, in Eastern Europe, there are a lot of so-called older volunteers now. People with business experience, and are going to Central Asia and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I think in the Reagan administration, you see a shift in the Peace Corps focus, and as they begin directing more people towards business backgrounds, and with the collapse of the former Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union, there's this emphasis on trying to instill capitalism and whatnot, and use Peace Corps volunteers as a way of doing that. So to that degree, you don't need English instructors in the Czech Republic or Slovakia or Romania, that kind of thing. But you probably do need somebody who can teach basic business skills, because in many of these societies that had been sort of suppressed for decades, generations. But again, what's always troubled me personally about that is that I'm not sure that countries like the Czech Republic or Poland or Belarus are really those that desperately need Peace Corps volunteers, that they still the places that can benefit most from young people with some energy and maybe some idealism are countries where people are living much closer to the edge.
Well, there's always been somewhat of a motivation of the U.S. government to want to put people that the government feels will present a positive image of the U.S. into that country. So there may be some, prodding a little bit to have a U.S. presence, on the ground in terms of Peace Corps volunteers.
That's true. I mean, it's always had, and one part of it has always been a diplomatic function. It's always been idealistic, and it's always been diplomatic. But yeah, I was hoping we would get into and discuss something that came across my desk recently was a message about a former country director from Peace Corps, who had self-named title was management consultant, and he was going into this discourse about how volunteers might not be serving their customers well enough. It was this business language, and I think that is something really different. It's a different part of Peace Corps today, and I definitely don't support it. But then on the other hand, I send my students and say, well, you can make Peace Corps. I mean, we really need to keep Peace Corps what we want it to be. And
I think that there's been, I think I've always been able to differentiate the volunteers in the field from the staff folks. And even when I was in, there was a big gap between the people who were running the country office and the volunteers who were in the field. And the people who were in the country office had lots of connections with the embassy, but after 2 years in Korea, most of the people in my group despised the embassy people, I mean, quite frankly. And we had very little to do with them. And the communications that came out from the embassy were routinely ignored. My hunch is that there's still a lot of that goes on. One of the interesting things I just wanted to point out is that the current ambassador who was just named a few months ago to South Korea is a woman and a former Peace Corps volunteer who served in Korea. So,
well, how do you think today that the Peace Corps fits in to, if we can consider it part of U.S. foreign policy, into U.S. foreign policy, or into the humanitarian aspect of what the U.S. is trying to do, given all the new issues that are emerged in the world, such as global terrorism and the changes that have taken place over the last few decades, fall of communism. You think Peace Corps still has an important role to play for the U.S.?
Absolutely, I do. And I think that, I hope and I believe, I think that gap, it's true, that gap is there. And I think that Peace Corps is is more important than ever because it's one of the few bright spots, perhaps, in the diplomatic scene, if you really look globally and look at the things that have happened over the last 8 years. So I think it's very important, and I suspect that a lot, I think volunteers are doing all the same things that you listed before. You know, I think that they're making friendships, they're sending letters back and influencing students here at home, doing jobs, but you know, the job that you do in Peace Corps has always been only one, maybe relatively small part of the whole thing. And that continues to be true. It takes such a huge amount of independence on the part of the volunteers. So yeah, that distance is really good from the, you know, the country directors who are so close to the diplomatic roles. Although I always felt like, you know, being in Barbados, it's such a tiny place. It's 166 square miles. So everybody was cheek by jowl with the, you know, the ambassador, with with any American, with the tourists. So it was such a good thing that we were, everyone knew Peace Corps, and so they knew that we weren't tourists. That was always helpful in our role there.
So we all have kids. If your children, you know, were struggling for what to do, what road to take toward the future, would you recommend the Peace Corps to them?
Sure, I have, to my daughter. You know, I think it's what troubles me, I think maybe a little bit like Loran, is that I think the U.S. government has mucked up our foreign relations so badly with so many countries around the world for the last at least 8 years that it's a more difficult situation for many Peace Corps volunteers to find themselves in. I think
but at the
the
same
amount
time,
of
would the
sort
Peace
of
Corps help?
hostility, well, it can, but I think the amount of hostility that one encounters towards Americans is much greater now than it was when I was in. And it's always been there, but I think it's much greater now. Which brings me to the point, I think there's still a very important role, and that's public diplomacy. Peace Corps volunteers are diplomats of a kind, even if they don't conduct themselves like the swallowtail diplomat crowd. But you do represent the United States, you represent your country, you represent your culture to folks. And most of us, I think, served in places where we were pretty obvious on the street. I mean, it was pretty hard in the little city town that I lived in to just sort of blend into the background. And in those kinds of societies, I always think of them as peasant societies. Everybody minds everybody else's business. And so when you stick out, people know what you're doing. So you have to pay attention to how you comport yourself to make sure that you're not making a fool of yourself, because people will see and people will know.
One of the things that I always tell people, who sometimes students, like a program that we have here in May with American students coming to campus, always ask me about the experience. I tell them that from what I've gathered in talking with so many other return volunteers is that every experience is so unique that even, you know, you could take 15 or 20 people in the same country, even in cities near each other, and their experiences can be totally different from the others. And I guess that's what makes it also so wonderful on a personal level. You never know what you're going to find is not necessarily what someone else in the next town or even in the same place that you're living in is going to find.
One of the follow-ups I would have to the previous comment is, I think the real value is to the United States, is to the people who come back and bring with them a knowledge that demystifies or demythologizes, is that a real word? The countries and cultures that you encounter. That you bring back a notion of Iran or Korea or Barbados that's probably very different from the image that the average American has of these countries and these cultures. And in doing so, over time, what you try to do is correct those erroneous notions of what are the Iranians up to.
Well, after with a 40-year gap for me, I'm doing that more than ever when people ask me, because when I came back, I found that most people didn't know anything about Iran, and in fact, Iran and Iraq in their mind were like the same place, but they weren't sure where those two were. And now, for other reasons, people know maybe too much at a superficial level. And so, if I look at my role as a former volunteer now, related to the country I served in, it's a very different one. It's trying to sort out what at least my experience of the culture was, as opposed to what all the political rhetoric tells us.
Yes.
Well, I really appreciate both of you coming today to talk about this. I hope it's been enjoyable for you and that it will be informative to our listeners. So,
Hope so.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you, Steve.
inviting us.
Thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you learned something about the Peace Corps, and maybe it'll be an avenue for you to explore in the future.